Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. We appreciate you joining us today, and we look forward to a very candid conversation. The title of this session is Closing the Gap, Survey Analysis of Employed Hispanic Parents. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Linda Smith, and I am the Director of the Early Childhood Initiative here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. BPC is a Washington, D.C. based think tank that tries to take the ideas of both sides of the aisle and put together policy recommendations that can answer our nation's most pressing problems. And obviously, childcare has been and remains one of those very pressing problems in this country. So today, what we're going to be discussing is the results of a survey we conducted very recently designed to provide insight into the preferences, needs, and choices of our Hispanic parents, and to take a look at how culture influences these parents' childcare decisions. Wherever possible, we will give you some information on how this population compares to the nationals that we've done. But many of you know that I think this is our 10th survey of parents, trying to really understand what is motivating parents, what do we need to do, and how do we address their preferences and their choices. So the first thing I'm going to do is turn it over to Catherine McCardo. She is a program analyst with the Early Childhood Initiative here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. And Catherine has been the single most driver in this survey work. She was adamant that we needed to do it. We got it done, and we're going to turn it over to her to give an overview of the thinking behind the survey before we go to Claire Taylor, whom most of you know. She's done a lot of survey work with us, and she will be giving you the results of the survey. So Catherine, I'm going to give it to you first.
Thank you, Linda. Through this next portion of the webinar, I will be speaking in both English and Spanish. To turn on closed captions, you can do so by clicking on the closed captions icon found at the bottom right corner of the video. To change the language of your closed captions, you can do so by clicking on the cogwheel. Please note that we will be taking questions from the audience, so please enter your questions in the chat or submit using hashtag #PPCLive through X, formerly Twitter. En la siguiente parte del seminario web hablaré en inglés y español. Para activar los subtítulos, puede hacerlo haciendo clic en el icono de subtítulos que se encuentra en la esquina inferior derecha del video. Para cambiar el idioma de sus subtítulos, puede hacerlo haciendo clic en la rueda dentada. Tenga en cuenta que responderemos preguntas de la audiencia, así que ingrese sus preguntas en el chat o envíelas usando el hashtag #BPCLive a través de X, formalmente Twitter. Primero, quiero comenzar explicando por qué realizamos esta encuesta. Slides, please. To start, one of our goals on the Early Childhood Initiative is to understand the childcare gap within the U.S., the supply versus potential need for childcare. However, the potential need does not equate to the actual demand. We've learned from our surveys that parents consider a range of factors when choosing a childcare provider, and this is not one size fits all. Some parents will never choose a formal childcare system, even if it were free and available. By focusing on employed Hispanic parents, we can narrow the gap for childcare through understanding parent preferences, their current arrangements, and barriers impacting access or affordability of care. I like to note that the difference between supply and potential need in this table does not equal the gap, because the methodology used accessibility measurements to calculate the gap. Para empezar, uno de nuestros objetivos en la iniciativa para la primera infancia es comprender la brecha en el cuidado infantil dentro de los Estados Unidos, o sea, la oferta versus la necesidad potencial de cuidado infantil. Sin embargo, la necesidad potencial no equivale a la demanda real. Hemos aprendido de nuestras encuestas que los padres consideran una variedad de factores al elegir un proveedor de cuidado infantil, y esto no es igual para todos. Al centrarnos en los padres hispanos, podemos reducir la brecha en el cuidado infantil al comprender las preferencias de los padres, sus acuerdos actuales y las barreras que afectan el acceso o el pago de la atención. Me gustaría notar que la diferencia entre la oferta y la necesidad potencial en esta tabla no es igual a la brecha, porque la metodología utilizó medidas de accesibilidad para calcular la brecha. There is another reason we conducted this survey. According to census data, the Hispanic community is one of the fastest growing groups in the US, a 21% increase from 2010 to 2020, yet data on this community is limited. Additionally, anecdotal beliefs assume that Hispanic parents prefer childcare provided by a relative because of cultural values, otherwise known as familism. It's through this survey that we aim to confirm or disprove these anecdotal beliefs while also providing more data about this community. La otra razón por qué realizamos esta encuesta es que, según el censo, la comunidad hispana es uno de los grupos de más rápido crecimiento en los Estados Unidos, un aumento de 21% de 2010 a 2020. Sin embargo, los datos sobre esta comunidad son limitados. Además, creencias anecdóticas han asumido que los padres hispanos prefieren el cuidado infantil proporcionado por un familiar debido a valores culturales conocidos como familismo. Es a través de esta encuesta que queremos confirmar o refutar estas creencias, al mismo tiempo que proporcionamos más datos de la comunidad. Our survey covers 4 areas: current childcare arrangements, childcare preferences, the value of Latino culture, and work arrangements. By focusing on these 4 key areas, we sought to better understand the current state of childcare for these parents, while also learning more about what factors matter most to them. We wanted to ensure our survey was as comprehensive as possible on this community, which is why we included cultural values and work arrangements across different generations. By doing this, we were able to gain clarity on the anecdotal assumptions around Hispanic parents' childcare preferences, and what we found might surprise you. Nuestra encuesta cubre 4 áreas: acuerdos actuales de cuidado infantil, preferencias de cuidado infantil, el valor de la cultura latina y acuerdos laborales. Al centrarnos en estas 4 áreas, buscamos comprender mejor el estado actual del cuidado infantil para estos padres y al mismo tiempo aprender más sobre los factores que más les importan. Queríamos asegurarnos de que nuestra encuesta fuera lo más completa posible. Por eso, incluimos valores culturales y acuerdos laborales entre diferentes generaciones. Al hacer esto, pudimos obtener claridad sobre las suspiciones anecdóticas y lo que encontramos podría sorprenderlos. Now, I'd like to welcome Claire Taylor, who will be sharing the results of our survey. Claire is a director for Morning Consult, where she leads survey research and messaging strategy for nonprofits, advocacy organizations, and government affairs. We've worked with Claire to develop the Early Childhood Initiative series of parent surveys over the last few years. Welcome, Claire.
Great. Thank you, Catherine, for having me here today. Like she said, my name is Claire Taylor. I'm a director at Morning Consult and excited to be here today to share what we've learned from our most recent survey among employed Hispanic parents. If we want to go ahead and bring up the slides, just as an overview, we have surveyed 11 surveys in partnership with Linda and her team at BPC. All of these are available for access on BPC's website, and you'll be hearing me reference back to some of these as I go through the presentation. Before we dive into the data from this survey, just a couple notes on methodology. Our surveys were conducted online, and we used quotas and weighting to ensure that the data was representative of the sample that we surveyed, 500 employed Hispanic parents. The employment classification included those working full-time or part-time, as well as those working in gig work or self-employed. The survey was available to be taken in Spanish as well. And just one note on terminology, throughout we'll reference formal childcare, which refers to a childcare center, family childcare home, pre-K and Head Start program, where informal childcare references care from relatives, parents, friend, or a neighbor. So like Catherine mentioned, these are going to be the 4 buckets of research that we look through today, starting with current child care arrangement. You'll notice throughout there's going to be some slides I'm going to be skipping just for the sake of time, but all of this data and this presentation will be shared in the chat for everyone to be able to reference. So to start looking at childcare arrangements, we asked parents, when do you need childcare? And we found that Hispanic parents are most likely to need childcare during traditional work hours. However, over a third need care over the weekends or outside of traditional hours. This is one place where we saw a difference in comparison to previous studies. It's about 10% more Hispanic parents who need care during the weekends or outside of traditional work hours. Across demographic groups, we see Hispanic parents who work in the service retail industry are especially likely to need childcare over the weekends and outside of traditional work hours, around 45%. Additionally, those who use a formal childcare provider, 90%, more likely than those using an informal childcare provider, 68%, to need care during traditional hours. I think this data point shows, and we'll see this throughout, that formal childcare providers are best suited to meet the childcare needs of those who need care during the traditional workday from 9 to 5. In this question, we asked parents, what is the current childcare arrangement that you're using? And we see that half, 54%, rely on informal childcare, including 17% relying on relative care. On the other hand, 43% are using some form of formal childcare arrangement, most likely to be using a childcare center of that bucket. And this is really consistent with previous survey. This was one of our first Mythbuster findings, is that of all the other parents we've sampled, it's really about a 60% to 40% split informal care versus formal child care. Across demographics on this question, we see income influences the child care provider Hispanic parents use. Those with a higher income level more likely to use a formal child care arrangement, while those with a lower income more likely to use informal, specifically relying on parent-provided care. Additionally, over a quarter of Hispanic parents with a child under 1 are currently using relative care. In an open-ended question, we asked why. So among parents using formal childcare, what factors most influence this decision? And these parents were most likely to reference trust, convenience, a word-of-mouth recommendation, and education as influential factors in selecting their childcare provider. Just to read one of these, someone said, childcare providers are very trusted and they care about children properly. And sometimes they give important lessons to our child. For these things, we can feel relief. And this is a consistent trend we'll be hearing is trust. And what does that mean to parents? And hearing it from specifically their mouths. Similarly, in a closed-ended question, we see health and safety, trust, and program cost are the most important factors for parents using formal childcare. Ranked lowest at the list is cultural compatibility at 8%. On the other hand, among those using informal childcare, we ask the same questions. What variables are top of mind? As expected, we see cost of care at the top, as well as trust, a preference for family care, and some references of distrusting the formal child care system. To read some of these quotes, someone wrote, "Finding someone I can trust to watch my kids. I don't trust daycare, so I let one of my family members watch them while both me and my spouse work." Another person wrote, "Budget was the biggest factor. Childcare is very expensive, and I think if I worked full-time, it wouldn't be worth it because all the extra money goes towards childcare, and I might as well spend time with my child in that case. I can only work part-time to not be a burden to my parents, but it's worth it because that money isn't getting sucked into childcare." Looking deeper here among those using relatives for childcare, we see a majority, 77%, report using grandparents to provide that care. This is consistent with previous studies. About 80% among employed parents told us they were relying on their grandparents. A new question we asked is here on the right. about why are you relying on relatives for care? And we see 48% value trusting the relatives to provide care, while 13% reference financial necessity. So I think this data point was another really interesting finding to us that, again, trust was really important. And throughout parents using a variety of types of care, trust is really top of mind. And to look here to cost, which is another top of mind factor, we see that over half of Hispanic parents, 58%, report that they pay for their childcare, and on average pay $270 on a weekly basis for their youngest child. Hispanic parents with a higher level of income are more likely to be paying for childcare and to be paying more. Additionally, 62% of Hispanic parents currently using relative provided care are paying for childcare. So across different childcare arrangements, people are paying for this care. And when asked about paying for their childcare expenses, a majority of Hispanic parents, 75%, do not receive financial help for their childcare expenses. Additionally, 48% have not or unsure how to claim childcare expenses on their income tax. Among those using formal childcare provider, this increases to 65% who have claimed their childcare expenses. This is another consistent finding we've seen across the different parent groups we've surveyed, just showing an awareness of the ability to claim childcare expenses. So next, moving into childcare preferences, we start with a tried and true question that we have asked on all 11 surveys. If childcare were free and in a convenient location for your family, what type of childcare arrangement would you most prefer for your youngest child? And what we see here is that even if childcare were free, Hispanic parents are most likely to prefer the childcare arrangement they're currently using. So among those using formal childcare, 73% prefer to continue in a formal childcare arrangement. Among those using informal care, 67% would prefer to continue using informal care. Even a subset of that, those using relative care, 50% would prefer to continue using relative care. And we'll come back to this. I think this is important to keep in mind as we think about different solutions, as that parents prefer a variety of childcare arrangements, and one size really doesn't fit all for Hispanic parents as we think about their preferred arrangement. Moving next here into what we call a max diff analysis, we use this, what we call a discrete choice methodology, to be able to understand the important factors that are influencing parents' childcare decisions. We asked respondents to make a series of forced choice responses of a larger list of like-type variables. We think this methodology is reflective of the decision parents have to make when choosing a childcare provider, as there's a variety of variables that are top of mind that they're trying to source through as they select what's best for their family. So in this question, the setup looked like what you see on the right side of the screen. Parents were asked to choose of the 5 variables they saw what was most and least important in selecting a childcare provider at this time. And that cycled through a couple of times, the list randomized, and they had to keep making those forced trade-offs. So we can see the results here on this next slide, and the data is a little different as it's not a percentage. We're comparing to that average utility score of 100. So here we see trust in childcare is the most important variable. It's nearly 4 times more important than the average variable. And followed by safety, cleanliness, prevention of illness, and quality caregivers. On the other hand, we see bilingual educational opportunities, providers who look like my family or share the same cultural background, as the least important variables at the bottom of the list. We asked this question back in fall of 2020, so a very different time as the pandemic was really hitting. And when we asked it at that point, safety, cleanliness, prevention of illness, as we can expect, had the highest score with the average utility score of about 300. And I'm just going to go through these different demographic groups we break out, and this is available. But across all of these, those top 3 variables remain the same: trust, quality care, and location being the top 3 variables across groups. And lastly here, we asked a smaller list for Hispanic parents to rank the importance, and we see the highest importance is placed on cost of care and school readiness over location, faith-based teaching, cultural values, and being Spanish speaking, which we're going to look into in the last section of analysis. Another open end here among parents who are currently using informal care but had previously used formal care. We asked, why did you stop using this child care arrangement? And while cost is the main reason parents reference, they also reference their personal preference or situation changing for why they're currently using an informal child care arrangement. Additionally, here among that group who's using informal childcare, we see location of that care and cost being key for Hispanic parents to consider using a formal childcare option. We see that over half would be likely to consider a formal option if it was affordable and if the location was close to where they worked or their spouse worked. There is more openness among employed Hispanic parents than other parents we've surveyed. These percentages are higher, which I think shows a little more openness among this group to consider using a formal childcare option. And that moves us into the section on value of Latino culture. Like Catherine mentioned, this was really key in this survey of understanding the value and influence of this as Hispanic parents are making childcare decisions. And as we've seen in previous questions, it's important, but it's not necessarily a make or break for parents, Hispanic parents. So we started with, how important is it to you that your child care provider incorporates Latino cultural practices, traditions, or values into the care for their child? And we see a majority of Hispanic parents say it's important for their child care provider to incorporate Latino culture, 58% saying it's essential or important, but not critical. So it's really split, and then others saying it's important, but not necessary. And on this slide, this is consistent across demo groups on future questions. We see that parents who are currently using a formal childcare arrangement are more likely to say it's important at 65%. I think this is probably goes to the fact that these parents are paying probably a larger amount for the childcare they're receiving. So there's a larger expectation for what their child is receiving in the formal childcare system. Another interesting difference here is across generation. We see it's more important to first and second generation Hispanic parents than it is to third generation parents for their child care provider to be teaching this. And this is, we'll see this across all of these different questions. So we'll be curious for the conversation on hypotheses on those findings. And looking here at this question, we asked for parents to force select which statement they more strongly represents their group, their view. I've had to sacrifice the quality of my childcare arrangements to ensure my child retains cultural and family values, versus I have had to sacrifice immersing my child in Latino culture and family values to ensure the quality of my current childcare arrangement. And we see a strong split here, 53% versus 47% of the sacrifices Hispanic parents have made. And this split was consistent across generation and across childcare arrangement. So you do see just this real divide in Hispanic parents and their preference and their expression of their experience. And lastly, in this section, a majority of Hispanic parents say their current childcare arrangement incorporates at least some Latino culture in addition to school readiness. So I think that's a good snapshot for the current landscape of this being involved in childcare arrangements. And so lastly here on work arrangement, this is a question we've asked in every survey, and it's the one I always can't let go. How far in advance are you aware of your work schedule? And we see here that over half of Hispanic parents who are working in a service or retail job are aware of their work schedule 2 weeks in advance or less. Among Hispanic parents currently using relative care, 51% are aware of their schedule 2 weeks in advance or less, compared to 40% of those using a formal childcare arrangement. So I think that can also go back to what we saw in the first slide of Hispanic parents who are working a traditional job, who are aware of their work schedule using formal childcare. Formal childcare is able to meet the needs of those parents, while those who have less awareness of their work schedule, need care in non-traditional hours or over the weekends, are more likely to have to use an informal childcare arrangement. And just to go through here, these are listed on the website across generation and community type, our findings, but just to leave us here, the 4 main findings I took away is that Hispanic parents value cultural education for their children. It is important to them. However, it's not a top factor when selecting a child care provider. Those top factors of trust, quality of care, location that have been consistent with our other surveys remain the top considerations for this Hispanic parents as well. To trust in the child care provider is the most important variable, which we saw in that max diff analysis. It's 4 times more important than the average variable. And we saw through those open ends some more color of what trust means to parents and really knowing and feeling that their child is cared for in whatever arrangement they're using. Consistent with previous data sets, we see that Hispanic parents prefer the childcare arrangement they're currently using, even if the childcare arrangement was free and in a convenient location. So one size does not fit all here. There's a variety of factors that Hispanic parents are bringing as they're making this decision. But location and cost are really key for those who are using informal childcare to consider using a formal childcare arrangement. And lastly, as we just saw, childcare responsibilities impact Hispanic parents' ability to work, and an unpredictable work schedule or different work hours may impact their childcare arrangement. And so with that, I'll hand it back over to Linda for the panel conversation.
I am, and I apologize for that. Somebody always does that, right? I want to thank Claire and Catherine for the presentations and all the work on this. And well, we don't think it's the end all of everything. We do think it's the beginning of what we need to understand about our parents and what their needs and choices are. So I want to turn to our panel now. I'm so excited to have these two on this panel to discuss this with us. First, Miriam Calderon. Miriam is the Chief Policy Office at 0 to 3, where she leads the development and implementation of 0 to 3's policy agenda, priorities, and strategies. In 2017, Calderon was appointed as by Governor Kate Brown to serve as the Early Learning System Director in the state of Oregon, where she led an agency responsible for the administration of childcare, preschool, home visiting, and sponsors and supports for the early childhood workforce. She has a much longer bio, and we are putting it in the chat. She's worked for the Obama administration, HHS, a number of different positions over her career. and brings so much to this conversation. And then the second panelist is Michael Lopez. Michael is a dear friend, and we go a long ways back on this, but Michael is currently the Senior Director of Strategic Initiatives of Early Child Care at Class Wallet. Previously, Michael was Vice President for Education and Child Development at NORC at the University of Chicago, where he had a team of researchers and evaluators who conducted studies to inform and improve policies and practices that affect the lives of children and families. I can't think of two better people to have this conversation with. So I'm going to start. Mary, I'm going to start with you and ask you to say a little bit more about your current work if you want to, but also what was your reaction to the survey and what surprised you, if anything?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much, Linda, Catherine, Claire, and folks at the Bipartisan Policy Center team for including me in this conversation. First, I want to start by saying Feliz Dia de la Mujer to everybody. It's International Women's Day. It's also my birthday, which gives you a sense of how important I thought this conversation was, because this is the only thing I'm doing today. But my abuelita, who was my caregiver and my baby's caregiver, taught me always how special it was to be born on this day, because it's celebrated around the world to celebrate how important women are. And so I want to first honor all the mothers, early educators, caregivers who are central to this conversation. I know many of whom are tuning in today. So yeah, this is really, again, exciting for me, and I just couldn't miss being part of this today, because I think, it's so, it's critical, and these data add so much to the discussion of, I think, what we're still trying to do, what I'm doing in my work at 0 to 3, which has been so much a part of my career and my passion, which is really trying to build build a more equitable early care and education childcare system, and one that can truly operationalize choice for families. And we really have a long way to go. And I think, two things first and foremost jump out at me. One is that, Latino families are essential to this conversation and how we build the system that can really operationalize choice. I think, as Catherine was talking about, they represent such a large share of the families with young children in our nation. And it's really critical that we understand more about their needs, preferences, and challenges, right, to be able to drive solutions. In terms of kind of some of my experiences and resonance with the data and the work I was doing in Oregon, first I'll say that, what jumped out at me is that Latino families are really experiencing a lot of the same challenges that all families are, balancing affordability. I think what we're seeing really in the data is, trust, safety is primary. They also really value and would like more time to care and educate their children, really in balancing that with the realities of work. And I think that, we have to pay attention to that. Sometimes that opens up other policy solutions, right? Which is some of what we do at 0 to 3 and thinking about policies like paid leave, how to support them with other programs like home visiting, and other family supports. So policies like, the child tax credit. So I think it just wanted to, also bring that into the equation. Those are also parts of the work that I did in Oregon, right, to really think comprehensively, right? Childcare and an early care and education system is essential to being able to lift more families with young children into opportunity. And it is a part of a broader set of solutions to meet the needs. And I saw that coming through in the data as well. But again, really being able to, stay, again, I think kind of focused on ECE. I think that we were also doing a lot of work similarly to really understand and get more of the perspective and voice of Latino families into the conversation and policy solutions that we were trying to drive towards as we were building our system. Similar to, I think, what you see here in these findings, the Latino community is very diverse nationally. It was in Oregon too. So understanding the generational differences, acculturation, linguistic, racial, ethnic differences. I think when you couple that with what we know about childcare markets, how regionally driven they are, really necessitated for us a lot of localized approaches, right, to understanding what our Hispanic families' childcare needs were, what their preferences were, what barriers they were experiencing, both and including with accessing public options, the relevancy of the systems we were putting in place for them to find care, enroll in programs, you know, and that really just driving towards more local and more local. I can't emphasize that enough. And really being able to not just take this community sort of as a monolith. So we had, for example, Hispanic families in rural parts of our state. It wasn't just an urban story, that were very, very different, right? And they had very different options in terms of care arrangements. Communities that spoke indigenous languages, Spanish was their second language, who had very little access to care except for Migrant Head Start, which was just, you know, certain times and parts of the year. So we really, really had to be very intentional about understanding this community in Oregon, regionally and locally, and understanding what care options were available to them, as well as their preferences and the barriers that they faced. I will say again, I think something else that stood out to me is some of the data around the challenges with the systems, right? And being able to access public options or knowing about those options. That kind of came up in the data. I think that's consistent with some of our experiences there too. We had a system, for example, subsidy that was really driving families, you know, enrolling through public benefits and public, you know, social service offices. And I think we had a lot of wonderings about and concerns about, you know, how effective that was for some of our Hispanic families. And we're really working on having other options to be able to rely more on trusted partners in the community to be able to support more options for families to be able to learn about the publicly funded options and be able to enroll in those. I think that a couple other points. One is just that I think the value, the high value on education and early childhood education came through in the data, which was very consistent, I think, with my experiences as well in Oregon and throughout my career. So, you know, I think we saw as well in Oregon a lot of support for preschool or, you know, programs that were focused around school readiness. I think a lot of support for bilingual education. I'm sure we'll come back to that. And that, you know, we also saw too that families wanted choices there. Sometimes, you know, programs and some parts of our state where there were school readiness programs that really included the family and were really family learning options, particularly for younger children in the toddler years that included parent and caregiver, and part of the learning experiences were real preferences. I think the safety pieces, I think were also really interesting to me. I think I'm sure we'll come back to that somewhat in the discussion, but we were doing, I think, a lot of work really around licensing during the time I was there. And so I'm really interested to sort of to come back to some of these ideas, as I think these are sometimes myths around, you know, not really, Latino families not really preferencing or wanting to participate in programs that are regulated. But I also think it means that some of our systems, like what we do to make licensing and systems like quality rating and improvement systems that are designed to provide parents with this kind of information relevant for our Latino families is really critical, especially given what we see about, you know, the emphasis on safety, which again is, I think, consistent for all families, including Latino families. So, you know, we were working on things like, again, moving very localized, developing things like early care and education sector plans that were very family driven. coordinated enrollment strategies, again, where we could drive more of enrollment across different settings and publicly funded and provider types to the community, and designing those with families, really thinking about, again, those systems like where families get information about safety and quality, and really thinking about how we redesign those, including making them more relevant for families. And then really supporting caregivers, things like staffed family network, staffed caregiver networks, professional development, career advancement, really targeting resources towards Latina early educators, caregivers. We think we saw a lot of it really matters, and parents notice and care and really consider that another support when we really are investing in those caregivers. So I'll stop there.
Yeah,
thank you.
That's a lot, and I have a ton of questions I want
Okay,
to
great.
which one, but first let's go to Michael. And Michael, your reactions to what the survey said and thoughts about moving forward.
Great. Well, like Miriam, I would like to thank you all for the opportunity to participate in today's discussion. And to the BPC folks, I think Linda, Claire, Catherine, an amazing job giving voice to this really important topic of Hispanic childcare preferences, need, and choice. It's such an important area. And so I was thrilled, Linda, when we were talking recently and you told me about this and then wrote me into to this presentation. Couldn't say no, could never say no to Linda, because this is really, really important. I think Miriam, wow, there was a lot of stuff there, but happy birthday, Miriam. But a lot of rich information that she provided on the policy context. I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of reactions to the study design, methodology issues, and it's probably not as much that was surprising about the survey data itself and the findings. That was surprising, especially given the particular sample and the fact that you did break things out by age, among other factors. That being said, I'd like to share just a couple of reflections to help people better understand the context of the study, because I know Claire did an amazing job, and Catherine, and in talking about the motivation for the study and what was done, and just impressive, really impressive. I loved listening to that part of it. But I think there's some things to underscore, and Miriam touched on a couple of them that relate to how to best interpret these findings and the implication for the findings. So it was great that you all designed the survey to capture information on so many different critical factors that contribute to some of those similarities or differences in the preferences and utilization patterns of Hispanic parents. And there are a lot of, people can dig into that. There's a lot of information there and a lot that gets at critical factors. And Miriam touched on some of those that have policy implications in terms of rural versus urban or generational status. And so there's a lot of richness there in the data. Based on this study and other similar research studies, including some of my own research, I know, Linda, we were talking, you and Catherine, we were talking about it. I want to point out that it's important to make a distinction between preferences versus utilization patterns. Mm-hmm. Because, and I know you know that, Linda, but part of that is that there's been a lot of myths and misunderstandings about preferences versus utilization patterns. They're not the same thing. Preferences may tend to be more closely related to cultural beliefs and practices, whereas utilization, what they actually do, reflects a much more complicated process of the intersection between some of those cultural beliefs and practices and many other factors that you captured there in, with the survey items. We have to be super careful not to overinterpret utilization patterns when we see it and infer meaning, because I think that's been the biggest downfall of a lot of prior work, is inferring meaning and or causation to cultural beliefs and practices. We think we were doing the right thing and saying, oh, it's about, the cultural preference, and then if we build it, they will come. But that's there's been a lot of problems with that approach, and people have been taking, like what you are all doing, taking a more careful approach to try and unpack what those different things are. Some of that prior work was really more about availability and accessibility of the childcare supply versus preferences. So if you go into some of the work that I had done in out in California with First 5 LA, where they built their entire model with the $600 million preschool expansion, they initially built it around the notion of, well, Hispanics, just like what you started off with, Hispanics, prefer family-based childcare. They built that model in the high Hispanic, high poverty communities. And unlike Field of Dreams, if we build it, they will come, they didn't. And so they had to scrap that. And that's when they discovered that, well, in those particular communities, there was very little supply. So families were having to figure out how to do it. So you didn't have the choices. You didn't have the options for some of the center-based type care options. So that's people become more cognizant of that. And that's why these kinds of studies are so important. So some of those factors, and I love seeing, including the parental employment status, the type of job, the need for care for non-standard hours or weekend hours. I mean, that was one thing that came out here, and it's such a critical, I know Miriam is probably can speak volumes of that based on her experience there in Oregon. The age of the child, Linda, I know you, Catherine and I talked about this, and you can see that there are differences by the age of the child in terms of their preferences and patterns, the number of children. Most of the sample was really more with one child, but that's important in terms of the number of children, the availability and accessibility of care options in the community. I didn't see as much of that here. And part of that is when you take this kind of data and overlap it with the availability data, like licensing data, to really see what was driving some of those choices in terms of what was available. And of course, cost you address, and the language and cultural match between families. We'll come back to that when we talk more about the cultural aspect of it. But I think, and Miriam mentioned this, she touched on this briefly, but I want to underscore it, that the Hispanic population, like other population groups, is a heterogeneous group, and it's not a homogeneous group. And so it's critical to take into account that variability in the population and the complex relationships or interplay amongst all the different variables in kind of a multivariate analytic approach. So I think, Claire, I kept wanting to see, like, okay, so once you take into account some of these things, do you see the similar patterns across different? You did some of that, but it left me wanting to do a little more, because there's not likely one single factor that's right. It's not whether or not they're rural or urban. It's not whether or not they're the college education or level of education or SES. There are the multiple factors, and they kind of come together in a complex way. I do want to just also underscore, and I know you know this, Claire and Linda and Catherine, but just so people are clear, it's always important to understand what the sample is, because this is intentionally focused on employed parents, as Claire, when you talked about sampling. But it's also, when you look at the demographics, it's a large proportion of college educated, middle SES, urban, most of which one child, most of the children are preschool age children, or higher proportion, I say. And a higher proportion of second and third generation. I'm not saying that to be critical, because I think it's important to understand, though, that when you think about it, especially from Linda, your question about the public policy implications, in that if public policy tends to focus on policies supporting childcare for a large or higher lower SES population, but higher proportion lower SES population, this may not be as directly relevant. So we can't over interpret the findings to apply to the universe of Hispanic parents. Not that you were saying that. I'm just in terms of how people understand what the implications of this important work is, and how to understand it for what it is, and then how to take that and look at it from what else do we need to be doing to further add to this.
Mhm.
I'm going to pause there because I know you have some additional questions.
Yeah, I think we don't have enough time already, just knowing all the questions but I do want to clarify one thing, because one of the things that started this work for BPC has been this, what is the gap between what we have and what we need? And then, to your point, Michael, if they build it, will they? I mean, if we build it, will they come? And I've never been completely convinced that if we need to build as much as there's a perception out there. That's why we asked the question, if it were free and available, would you use it? Because I think to your point, there's a whole lot of, things built into their decision making that we don't understand. So how close can we get to understanding the public's real, what do they really want? I use the terms demand versus potential need when I talk about this, because I think there's a potential need for what we know now, based on our gap work that we've done, a very large potential need. But what's the actual demand going to be? And what we've been trying to figure out in these surveys is, how do we know the difference here? I always say to both of your points, and not, anything but being honest on this one. To Miriam, I think you said this. We do national survey work. I mean, that's who we are. What we've always said is when it gets down to making decisions at a community or a state level, you need to do that work yourself. You can only rely on national data for a very big part of the picture. So we've written, as some of you said, the illusion of we've talked about the illusion of childcare. We know that there are no choices for a lot of people. And so what they have is very much based on parents not able to say, I'm putting my child where I don't really think it's safe or it's quality or any of those things. I think we have a problem. And Miriam, I guess I want to start asking you this question. I think every survey we've said, and Claire, you may want to jump in on this. I think what we've seen over all of the 10, 11 surveys we've done is we don't have a very flexible customer-driven system in this country. I mean, when you look at the hours that parents continually say they need, and the ability of the system to respond to it, it just doesn't. And I'm not sure, I mean, we know that, but what do we do about it? And is that what you found in Oregon, I guess?
100%, Linda. And I think that what to come back to some of the points I touched on, I don't know that these were necessarily the answers, but I think where we were headed was trying to see if this was, going to get us closer, right, to really being able to, like I said, operationalize choice, have the right kinds of, I think, public funding, public sector interventions into this market-based system. And one of the things that we were trying and testing was what I think of as like an essential infrastructure. Or essential infrastructure for this childcare system, and it's very local, right? One is these early care and education sector plans. So this was this idea that we needed this information locally that gets into the nuance that Mike was talking about and you were talking about, right? And that was critical to have much more to local level, not even at the state level was too big, right? Like it was still right. at too high of an altitude. And that every public dollar that we put into subsidizing care, we knew was really building supply. And that needed to align to what those sector plans were telling us, right? Over time, obviously, the market would better dictate and what choices families made. I think Mike's example is illustrated. Sometimes it is really informative. Sometimes you get it wrong, right? You think, but that was, I think, one of the things we were aiming at. And then the other one was, again, those coordinated enrollment, that as another essential infrastructure where we were saying across all of these funding streams. And I think when we think about this community as well, and this is picked up in the data, public funded, I mean, Latino families are working, they're working and still more likely, and this has been consistent from the data, Mike can speak to this, to be eligible for a lot of our publicly funded programs that are, targeted to low income families. And then they're also, and a lot of these systems really aren't, or ways of finding out about these programs aren't really often, reaching these families. But how do we also they're difficult to navigate for any family, right? And they often are so siloed themselves. So how did we build that better infrastructure, again, with families kind of at the table and more local? I think that we have overlapping infrastructures designed by funding streams. You know this, we've talked about this. So those were two areas where we were going. Again, it took a real responsibility to say, we've got we're still building this sector, and it's a public-private, system as it is right now, with very little public dollars. So when we put the public dollar in, how are we really using that as an opportunity? to build infrastructure locally and also build supply aligned to what we are understanding families, needs are and preferences.
Michael, I'd like for you to talk a little bit more about this. We've been trying to dig into the use of subsidy dollars by Hispanic families. What are you seeing in your research? And I mean, how do we get this population, the services more when we are talking about the lower income families? It does seem that their participation in some of these programs is lower. I'm not the right one to make those kind of calls right now on this webinar, but I do think that we've got challenges when it comes to the equitable distribution of some of these programs and services. And I'd like to hear what you've found on that.
Well, I think that's a really important question. And I think Miriam touched on something that I think relates to this, and that is this kind of the coordinated enrollment as the different array of publicly funded care options have grown. In some localities, there's starting to be some competition among them, and so you have Head Start, subsidized childcare, state pre-K, and how do you do a better job of coordinating so that there is that, kind of like what Miriam was suggesting, the coordinated enrollments. That's not all a perfect solution, because I know in Chicago we did some work, and I think I'd mentioned this to you, Linda. We had done a study looking at Hispanic childcare utilization, and we found a much higher rate of utilization of publicly funded preschool when we took into account all the different funding streams. But one of the things, the unintended consequences, was that was just around the time they were doing a coordinated enrollment system that then led to a decrease in the Hispanic enrollment, because they had been very focused on supporting the Hispanic population in Chicago and in Illinois in general. But what happened was, because of the requirements for childcare subsidies were different than state pre-K, for Head Start and others, there are some real or perceived barriers to the requirements. And apologies, Linda, given your former role in the Office of Child Care, but it's a higher bar for subsidized childcare, and it requires more paperwork, which for immigrant Hispanic population, you're dealing with real or perceived, because it doesn't have to be a real concern about their eligibility, whether they're eligible, whether their children are eligible, or whether providing the kind of documentation, the higher level of documentation, opens my family up to greater scrutiny. And so they saw a decline in the Hispanic enrollment because they did a good thing in coordinating, single one-stop shopping, single enrollment, registration and enrollment, but that led to this unintended consequence. So I think we have to keep that in mind, that even if we know that, okay, children are eligible, that's not always the case in terms of the perception, and whether or not then that bar of what you have to do with work requirements, and if I'm undocumented, does that create a barrier, unintended or not?
I think that there is confusion over that, and we knew that when I was in government, that the eligibility is based on child status. And I think, but that doesn't say that it's easier or less frightening, that is what is going on, to your point. What if with these challenges, I guess would be the thing, what policy changes would be helpful to fix some of this? And I think it's a combination of the eligibility, definitely all of the different funding streams, and how do we ever begin to deal with that? But what else in your mind would help break some of this down? Start with you, Miriam.
Yeah, well, one, I know we've talked about, Linda's. I'd love to see us be able to move to more community-based eligibility. I think, again, we would love to be able to also integrate classrooms more. And I think we do a lot of this. We had a lot of complexity based on, different cutoff points in terms of income, and sort of also changes for families. I really think that we could eliminate. We know that also there is a lot, I think, that is here around families are making decisions also about, proximity and location to home and work. We know things around child development as well. that are about where you live, right, and your community, and supports. And I think we want to be able to really be able to build programs that way, and alignment as well with schools. So I think there's a lot of benefits to really looking at that. And I think that that would go a long way as well with some of these barriers. And quite honestly, also make it easier then for programs and systems to be able to streamline some of the eligibility and enrollment processes. So I think it's something we need, we should be looking at and experimenting with. I've had some experiences being able to do that with flexibility with Head Start and pre-K. And I think, it would be great to look at. And I think one of the things we're going to have to reckon with, and I know we're almost at time, is also, which is right at the heart of this, is like, work, the divide between work, education and care, right? And work and the child benefit part of this as well. So I'll leave it at that.
I would just add a quick note, because I know that we're pretty much out of time, but there's also the issue that came up that Claire mentioned in terms of hours and non-standard hours, weekend hours, and comprehensive services. And Head Start provides comprehensive services, and we've heard a lot over the years around families with children with disabilities, where they can get more readily receive comprehensive services for children with disabilities in Head Start versus if they were in a state pre-K or just in subsidized care. And then part day versus full day. There's more and more programs are going to full day. But so there's a couple of other different dynamics that add on to what Miriam was saying.
Mm-hmm. We got one quick question, Claire, that came in from the audience, and that was, what did you see? Did you look at rural versus urban, and what did you see? And we have been trying to sort that out, but I don't know the answer to that. What is that in this survey?
Yeah, that was a slide we had towards the end. We had about 50% urban, 38% suburban, 13% rural. And looking across, we saw that some differences outlined about childcare arrangement. Urban more likely to be using a formal childcare arrangement. Distance to care, which is consistent in expectation of much more likely to have a childcare program closer to home. Preference based on what they're currently using, they're more likely to prefer that. So we see that difference in formal and informal. So those are some, they're there. Yes.
We are out of time here. We probably should have planned this for the hour and a half, because there's, so many more questions to answer. I do want to, first of all, happy birthday, Miriam, and thank you. Appreciate it so much. Your perspective, especially from the state level, but all the work you've done on this is greatly appreciated. And Michael, so appreciated of everything that you've done and all the different support that you've provided over the years in this research area. I want to actually close by telling the audience, if you do have questions that we didn't get to, generally speaking, we do try to answer questions and do follow-up. So if you had questions we didn't get to them, contact us or put them in the chat. Closing, I would want to stress to everyone in the audience that how important it is to do these things at the community and the local level. We in Washington, we have to admit we do not have those answers, that it's very important that you get out and talk to people and get them to the table in the conversation. Until we do that for all of our groups of people, we're never going to get the answers we need to develop the kinds of policies that will help parents across the board. So with that, I want to say thank you to everyone. Thank you to Claire, Miriam, Michael, Catherine. In a great conversation. We really did need more time, but thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.